I'm very sorry I can't be with you in Poznan, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity to present at least this way. It's an honor for me. I took the liberty of editing the title of my presentation a little bit. Sorry for that. So I'm starting now. In summer 1964, two sole exhibitions of Cuban artist Raúl Martínez took place in Havana simultaneously. The rather anticipated exhibition of his abstract expressionist paintings at the National Museum of Fine Arts and his brand new painting series Homages in English, presented at Havana Gallery. Especially for the later one, the majored artist became a subject of interest in Cuban medias. Nowadays, art historians consider the exhibition groundbreaking. After some 15 years, Martínez left abstraction. Instead, he started to incorporate collages and graffiti-like inscriptions in his paintings and began a transition towards pop art. During the second half of the 1960s, he eventually developed his own visual language, which later became part of the Cuban revolutionary iconography and made Martínez one of the most recognized Cuban authors of the second half of the 20th century. In an interview published in July 1964 in Cuban weekly magazine Bohemia, Martínez was asked what stood behind this transition. In his answer, he recalled a formative course of scenography led by Czechoslovak set designer Ladislav Vychodil. It would be daring to attribute to this single reference any fundamental significance in formation of a local Cuban version of pop art. In this case study, however, introduces a brief discursive analysis to the short period of time in the mid-60s, pointing out the complexity of the cultural relations between both countries and the cultural transfers in the bipolar world in general. The mentioned intensive professional course of scenography was organized as part of the fulfillment of the Czechoslovak-Cuban Agreement on Cultural Cooperation, which was signed in 1960 as the first of its kind in post-revolutionary Cuba. Moreover, it took place as the first event to fulfill the agreement of several culturally developed Eastern Bloc countries to selectively specialize in supporting particular artistic fields in Cuba. For its significant international reputation, Czechoslovakia was selected to focus explicitly on the field of theater, among other fields. The Czechoslovak embassy in Havana described this task as important because, quotation mark, it falls into the period of essential reorganization of the entire Cuban theater industry, and there is therefore an opportunity to significantly influence its further direction. However, also the Cuban side was well aware of the important political value of the entire theater industry, next to the film industry, of course, which was proven by its immediate institutionalization only a few months after the triumph of the revolution in 1959. The scenography course itself took place for 3 months at the turn of the years 1963 and 64 in Havana. The teachers were the prominent Slovak stage designer Ladislav Vychodil and costume designer Ludmila Purkyňová, both representatives of Slovak National Theatre in Bratislava. Only 7 students graduated from the course, including Raúl Martínez. They were mostly authors from various fields of art, design, and architecture, with only occasional professional experience from theater, although nowadays all of them are prominent artists considered pioneers in their fields. The rhetoric of the course was strongly Europocentric. One of participants, Maria Elena Molinet, for instance, remembered Vychodil repeatedly comparing the current level of Cuban scenography to the European level 50 years ago without any chance to catch up. It corresponded to the Czechoslovak, but also Cuban propaganda, where Cuban theater before the revolution was reduced into cabaret stages with purely commercial purposes, while the initial level of stage design was very low or didn't exist at all. On the other hand, Vychodil personally admitted a certain potential to scenography in Cuba. Its guarantee of success should have been, according to him, the exceptionally high level of architecture and visual arts in the country. He also highlighted the possibility of a fusion of traditional Cuban visual concept of theater, such as monumental and vivid narrative variety shows, which he visited in Teatro Martí in Havana, with modern European scenography that could lead to the establishment of a specifically Cuban style. In all cases, when the course outputs were presented in form of an exhibition at the House of Czechoslovak Culture in Havana, the attendance was extraordinarily high, and it was evaluated in Cuban press with the words, "After this exhibition, we can talk about scenography as an entirely new field of art," an exclamation which also Czechoslovak communist daily newspaper Rudé Právo took over. On the Czechoslovak theater design scene of the 1960s, Slovak Ladislav Vychodil stood somewhat in the background, behind Czech authors Josef Svoboda and František Trster. But he actually had all the prerequisites to pass something on in Cuba. First, his rather moderate and poetical approach to scenography seemed to resonate very well with the Cuban reality during the early years of the US blockade. In the scenography course, he considered the limited sources of technical materials as a creative challenge, and he initiated the use of local alternatives to develop structures and surfaces, as basis of scenographic solutions. Second, he was generally opposed to the excessive use of theater technologies, the background of which was very limited on the island too. In contrast, for example, with his more famous contemporary Josef Svoboda, the co-author of Latina Magica, for instance. He preferred an aesthetic and conceptual approach to productions, leaving the maximum attention to the actors. Moreover, in his own works, he extensively used artistically dramatic possibilities of graphic design in three-dimensional space. They were, in his case, often manifested in the form of certain decorativeness and linear poetics of hatches and nets. This approach could actually correspond with what Raúl Martínez wrote about his participation in the scenography course in the previously mentioned interview from July 1964. "I have always had a kind of fascination for the theater, but I had the impression that set design posed very specific three-dimensional problems that I wasn't sure I could address correctly. It occurred to me to look for solutions following a method similar to the one I use in my typographic work. This is including collages in my projects, photos and drawings, cut and pasted, that allowed me free associations." Unlike Vychodil, Martínez actually was very experienced and successful graphic designer and typographer by then. He gained graphic design and photography skills during his one-year study stay at the Institute of Design in Chicago in 1952, and he worked for a living in an advertising agency in Havana. Above all, after the triumph of the revolution, Martínez found himself in the center of yet still enthusiastic community of intellectuals surrounding the internationally recognized cultural magazine Lunes de Revolución. And as its artistic director, he was free to experiment with modernist typography and apply what he previously learned in commercial sector, but this time for social purposes. After the course of scenography, Martínez devoted himself to the theater design rather occasionally. However, among his most significant spatial works, there is design of the monumental ideological exhibition Del Tercer Mundo, from the Third World, held in 1968 in Havana. On the concept of the large-scale photographs hung on graphic-like structures, the reference of collage is evident. The accompanying light installations extending from the exhibition space on surrounding buildings in honor to the fight of Latin American liberation was processed purely graphically, while juxtaposing the ideological message with the massive modernist architecture, mostly from the previous regime. Finally, in the 28 canvases of the Homenaje painting series, Martínez, and in his own words, experimented with the method of collage in the same way as used in his scenography projects. On the paintings, expressive gesture-stroked structures coming from his abstract expressionist experience overlap each other with fragments of reality. Yet in 1964, Martínez made no secrets that he found himself in a creative crisis. He was searching for a new form of expression of the new reality of his country after the revolution. As its reflection, he started to collect elements of popular art as observed in his surroundings, frequently through the lenses of his camera. Martinez acknowledged to be aware of the points of contact with the work of Robert Rauschenberg, right in the mentioned interview from 1964, and he considered that encouraging. The proximity of both authors was not only formal. It is clear, for example, through the recurrent motif of time, although later in the 80s, Martinez humbly admitted to be more primitive in these works comparing to the sophisticated Rauschenberg's approach. But the official reception of the Homenaje exhibition in Cuban press was actually not clearly positive. The recognized Cuban art critic Edmundo Desnoes wrote, as hinting an uncertain future of the whole world, "Is this art? We don't know yet, nor do we know if nuclear energy and rockets will be used to destroy or to build the world." But even abstract expressionism was no longer accepted in Cuba in the mid-60s, where the freedom of artistic expression was declared, but inconsistently, and the official doctrine was slowly turning to socialist realism, even though it never reached it in the end. Thus, whereas in the occasion of the touring exhibition of contemporary Cuban art held in Prague in 1962, Martinez's abstract expressionist paintings were rejected in Czechoslovak press for being, quotation marks, too derived from the art salons of the Western world. In Cuba, Desnoes swept them away a bit more politely. Raúl is not any swindler who repeats what we already know. Picasso is an old man, and abstract expressionism is already part of the most conventional designs of fabrics, ashtrays, and advertisements. Martinez's final artistic language developed in the following years after the Homenaje exhibition can be seen as an ultimate figurative synthesis of his experiments with collages, typography, and photography, and of course with notion of the international pop art scene. Since I really like landscape so much, I asked myself, what is Cuban landscape? The answer was the heroes of the revolution, the people, stated publicly in 1965. Four statement journals and serial portraits direct all attention to the people as the actors of various ages, genders, and ethnic groups alongside with Cuba's revolutionary leaders. His work held visual strategies associated with devices used in Andy Warhol's pop art. However, the multiplication of images is not intended to diminish the heroes' individualities, as in Warhol's works, but rather to represent their omnipresence. At the first sight, Martinez's paintings might seem ideological or even at tools as state propaganda. But in reality, his own relationship to the revolution must have been ambiguous even then in 1964. The mentioned Lunes magazine, or rather its ban in 1961, became an infamous example of the beginning of persecution in Cuban artistic scene. The economic and social situation was rapidly deteriorating in the country, and although the proclaimed homophobia began only in 1965, in reality it was present much earlier. The agricultural forced labor camps, the so-called military units to aid production, were established and set an omnipresent fear, especially in the LGBT intellectual community of which Martinez was a part. In 1971, the so-called Padilla affair marked the beginning of the Gray period. For his homosexual orientation, Martinez lost his job as a professor of design, and he was banned from organizing own exhibitions, which in the end lasted more than 10 years. But meanwhile, the country intensively exported his graphic works, among works by other authors, as a proof of artistic freedom in the socialist country. Martinez posters were included in the pioneering London exhibition Art of Revolution in 1970, accompanied by a famous Seasons of Life essay pointing the world's attention to Cuban poster school. In the Czechoslovak environment, Martinez was among the most highlighted authors in the occasional local exhibitions of Cuban graphic design. Ironically, most celebrated was his quotation mark commitment to the revolution. Moreover, colorfulness of his palette was commented with racist undertones while attributing it to the colorfulness of the Cuban nation. It is curious to mention that in the previous decade, the activism of Martínez's vanguard artistic group Los Once was aligned with the democratization movement led by Fidel Castro against the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. Thus, in the 1950s, he participated in political process just through his art for art's sake. With his new version of pop art, Martínez managed to subvert the official discourses of the new regime while using their own representation. The subversive interpretations of Martínez's canvases penetrated into recent art history publications, especially after publishing, surprisingly in Cuba, his genuine autobiography in 2007. For example, the painting Burro Numero Uno from the Homenaje series, the newspaper clipping saying, "All hemp consumed will be Cuban," ironically recalls the unfulfilled promises of the revolutionary government, with the mentioned notion of running time, containing the sign tiempo muerto as time out. On the canvas, 9 repetitions of Fidel and the microphones, what seems to be as a celebration of Castro, can be equally a controversial questioning of the new socio-political system. The monumental joint portrait, inspired by the mass mobilization in support of the sugar industry and perhaps also the agricultural forced labor camps, ironically represents workers next to artists, intellectuals, and revolutionary leaders with romantic gazes, eating ice cream, daydreaming, everyone with an olive greenish complexion, metaphorically alluded to the castrist ideology. And even the most emblematic film poster, Lucia, could refer to its psychedelic colorfulness to the hippies and gay men interned in the agricultural forced labor camps, in contrast with the mentioned interpretation with Czechoslovak press. To conclude, in the framework of the bipolar world, Czechoslovakia and Cuba belong into the same side, while in the global perspective of the relationships between the center and periphery, they were both in a certain sense peripheries, referring especially to Slovak scenography, relating to several centers. Furthermore, in Piotr Petrovsky's terminology, the non-European other, which occupied the position of the distant other, and the Eastern European other, which is close, European, but marginalized. But even within these two different others, one could clearly be considered as the colonizer and one the colonized. But the situation was more complex. If it is accepted that one of the triggers around Martínez's transition toward pop art was his practical experience with scenography as told by Czechoslovak experts, and by the way, from the region where, according to Piotrowski, quotation mark, no great pop art could develop, through mediating the experience with multidisciplinary work, three-dimensional solutions, dramatic associations, searching for alternative materials and techniques, and finally, possibly also giving the attention to the figures as actors of the scene, it is possible to view Martínez's subsequent work as one monumental metaphorical theater. In this case, it is the original intentions of the entire Czechoslovak-Cuban cultural cooperation should be reminded. As stated in one of the reports leading to the signature of the Agreement of Cultural Cooperation in 1960, Czechoslovak side is expected to reorient the previously imported North American culture to the artistic values of socialist countries. Then it is curious to remember the words of Cuban curator Gerardo Mosquera in the exhibition catalog of Martínez's first large retrospective exhibition held in 1988, saying, Raúl has been one of the best importers of North American culture, being instrument in shifting Cuban artists' attention from Europe to the US. Thank you very much.